Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by William Croft Dickenson. It's a witch story, and a pretty good one. It's called Quieta non Movere. I had joined a group in the common room and found Staunton holding forth on Black Andy's tale of Todd Prague. That Solon piking at the line, he said, turning to Patterson, is the finest touch in the whole tale. It's part and parcel with the eerie nature of the Bass Rock itself. Patterson nodded, but it was Henderson, our medieval historian, who spoke next. Yes, he said slowly, I agree that with Black Andy and Staunton, that the Bass is an unco place, eerie, as you say. But there's another place, not so far from the Bass, where there is also the plash of the sea and the rock echoes, but which, to my mind, is more eerie and more awe-inspiring still. I mean the ruins of Wolf's Crag, on that precipitous and well-nigh inaccessible promontory of rock, with the cliffs rising sheer behind them. And while Stevenson would write a tale to fit the Bass, Wolf's Crag, as you know, has its own tale. That queer story about Barbara Napier and the black dog. It, too, is a story which fits the very place itself, and could almost be a part of it, and which could be said to be even stranger than Todd Prague, for some of it is true and can be checked from contemporary records and accounts. Don't know it, said Staunton bluntly, and when it was soon evident that we were all equally ignorant, Henderson told the following story that is now haunting my mind to the exclusion of everything else, and for reasons that may sound fantastic, but to me are only too real. One or two of you, Aiken I expect for one, will know that in 1594 Logan of Restalrig, who then held the castle of Wolf's Crag, made a formal agreement with Napier of Merchiston that Napier should help him find a poise of treasure supposed to be hidden in the castle or its grounds. Possibly Napier had in mind some form of divining, some early type of mine detector, if you like, for the invention of the logarithms was an inventor in other ways, too. As the story goes, however, Logan soon poured scorn on Napier's methods, and Napier abandoned the project. All that is probably true. The written agreement is still in the Napier manuscripts, and it has been printed with a facsimile in Mark Napier's memoirs. But, continues the story, as Napier left the castle, doubtless having drawn his expenses as laid down in the agreement, he told Logan that if he wanted magic to help him find his treasure, he should go to his kinswoman Barbara Napier, and he'd get magic enough. Again probably true. Barbara Napier, as you know, was one of the famous coven of North Berwick witches who were accused in 1590 and 1591 of trying to raise a storm to wreck James VI's ship, or that of his bride when the king and his queen were on their way to Scotland from Denmark. And while most of the witches were put to death, Barbara Napier was lucky enough to be acquitted, though the jury themselves got into trouble for their clemency. The next bit, I agree, is less well authenticated, but you will soon see how closely it fits with well-known fact. Logan, it is said, did consult Barbara Napier, who gave him a large black dog which, she averred, would scent out the treasure for him. More than that, she assured him that the dog would henceforth be the guardian of Wolf's Crag, and would never cease to guard it until, so she said, your bones find their last resting place in your grave. Now, witches throughout all history have been credited with double meanings in their words and prophecies, and if there is any truth at all in this part of the legend or tradition, here was the double meaning with a vengeance. For Logan's bones never found their last resting place in his grave. In 1609, Logan, then dead, was accused for art and part in the Gowrie conspiracy. His bones were dug up from his grave and brought into court for trial in accordance with the Scottish law of treason. And since he was found guilty, his bones were not returned to his grave. So the black dog, whether or not it had scented out the treasure, and the local tradition is silent on that, and whether or not it had ceased to watch Wolf's Crag during the years that elapsed between Logan's death and the exhumation of his bones, and on that too the local tradition is silent, again became the guardian of the castle in 1609. Logan's bones, to stress Barbara Napier's ipsum verba, had not found their last resting place in his grave. Of the holding and haunting by the black dog, I need tell you little. Tradition has it that for a long time the whole neighborhood was terrified. At night, the dog could be heard baying to the moon, a chilling sound even when it's an ordinary, inoffensive dog that's doing the baying, but unnerving in the extreme when it's a hellhound and the undying gift of a witch. By the day, no one dared approach the place. It is said that upon one occasion a cotter, living in the nearby steading at Dowlaw, who had been kept awake all one night by the dog's baying, vowed the next morning that he would finish the dog and be done with it. Despite all attempts to hold him back, the cotter went down to the castle on his self-appointed task. He did not return, and no one had the courage to seek him in the precincts or even the vicinity of Wolf's Crag. 3 days later, however, he was found far inland, wandering about the fields, half naked, and a gibbering idiot unable to put two words together to make sense. More than that, though he lived on for several years, tended by his wife and children, the raw wound of a bite on his neck, perilously close to the trachea, would never heal, but continued to fester until the day of his death. Even Cromwell's troops avoided the place in 1650, despite all their outward assurances of spiritual protection. Then, to stay in those parts, came the Reverend David Home, fearless covenanter and field preacher, a man whom no decree of the Privy Council could silence in his preaching, and, effatori, a man who could allow no agent of the devil to be at work in his own parish. Once again a man went down alone to face the black dog of Wolf's Crag, and this time it was the minister, armed only with his Bible and his bands. Then, after many hours, the minister returned, and the whole of his people, men, women, and children, were waiting for him. And, sore afraid, they had stood at a safe distance, their hours of waiting being spent in prayer and the singing of psalms. Slowly, with great effort, the minister climbed the path towards them. They ran to meet him, and as they drew nearer, they could see that his face was drawn and white, while his eyes shone within it like great coals of fire. But to all their questionings he could only answer with the same words, "The Lord hath prevailed. Blessed be the name of the Lord." It was a story well worth the inclusion of Woodrow's Analytica. It was no wonder his fellow preachers likened him to Benaiah in the book of Samuel, who, alone, went down and slew a lion in the midst of a pit in the time of snow. Certainly, from that day onwards, the black dog of Wolf's Crag troubled the people no more. Later, in his field conventicles, the minister spoke at times in slightly greater detail, but always in the language of the Old Testament. A few of his sermons were printed in the collection called The Head of the Corner, and there you will notice two interesting references. In the one, he says, "Even as Joshua commanded great stones to be rolled into the mouth of the cave that the 5 kings of Makkedah might be imprisoned therein, so did the Lord command me when I had overcome the beast of Baal." In the other, gradually it became known that when he had overcome the black dog of Wolf's Crag, and the secret of his victory died with him, the minister had cast it into an aumbry in one of the castle walls, and had sealed up the opening with stones. And that aumbry is still there, in the ruins, and still sealed up. "And you say the aumbry is still there, and still walled up?" asked someone. Henderson nodded. "And no one has had the curiosity and the courage to remove the stones to see if there is anything behind them?" put in Drummond. "No," replied Henderson, "at least not so far as I know. Despite the National Education Acts, the March of Science, and so forth, the local people still believe the story of the dog and, if you like, still think it is better to leave well alone. Even the Ministry of Works may have had somewhat similar thoughts. Certainly when the ruins of the castle were placed under the guardianship of the Ancient Monuments Board, and various repairs were carried out, the aumbry was left as it was." So the talk went on this way and that, and amid it all, I little thought that within a few days Davidson and I would be opening up that aumbry ourselves, only to wish we had left it alone, and now to wonder where our folly will end. I had picked up Davidson in my car, and we had driven out to Dunbar to look at the old town wall, which was under threat of demolition. We had seen what we wanted to see, we had spoken to a number of people who were in favor of preservation, we had had lunch, and it was still early afternoon. It was then that Davidson suggested a visit to Wolf's Crag, and I readily concurred. I simply wanted to see a walled-up aumbry and nothing more. On the way there, I again heard the story of the black dog, exactly as Henderson had told it. I knew I would, for Davidson has forgotten more about the ruined abbeys and castles of Scotland than the rest of us have ever learned. But I wasn't prepared for what followed. I've often felt like removing those stones, he concluded, just to see if there's anything behind them. I'm willing to wager that whatever may be there, it won't be the skeleton of a dog. And with that, I made our first mistake. I've got an old entrenching tool in the boot of the car, I said rashly. Good, he cried with enthusiasm. We'll do it this very afternoon. I'll shoulder all the responsibility with the ancient monuments people, though if we replaced the stones, I doubt if anyone would be any wiser. It was settled as easily and unexpectedly as that. These things usually are. We regret our temerity afterwards. So, on a Sunday afternoon in June, the two of us stood before a walled-up aumbrey in the ruins of Wolf's Crag, and I had an old entrenching tool in my hand. Everything seemed peaceful enough, with the calm water and the seabirds wheeling overhead. Though I'll admit I felt more keyed up than I would have if I had been standing ready to remove any other walling in any other ruined castle. Almost certainly Davidson felt the same. It was natural that it should be so. We both knew the story of that aumbrey too well. Then Davidson reached out his hand. He took the tool from me and inserted its smaller pick-like end between two of the stones in the topmost course. That was simple enough, for it was a dry stone walling, tightly packed with stones of smaller size. But although Davidson picked out the packing fairly easily, and could bring a good pressure to bear on his chosen stone, somehow or other it seemed immovable. Muttering to himself, he chipped out more of the packing and tried again. Still the stone refused to move. I remember thinking that if the Reverend David Home had laid those stones, he had laid them and packed them well. In the end, we took it in turns. Both of us had the feeling that we were not going to be defeated. Perhaps it was that which deflected us from the wiser course. As it was, we levered and prized at that stone for perhaps half an hour, sweating and grunting as we worked, until at last it began to move. Yet even when the stone appeared loose enough to be drawn out easily, it seemed to come unwillingly, almost as though something or someone was contesting it with us. Then, suddenly, it came out, so suddenly that it slipped through our hands and fell to the ground with a thud, leaving an opening in the wall, perhaps 9 or 10 inches square. And at once we both stepped back and looked at one another. "What was that?" asked Davidson sharply. "I don't know," I answered. We were both shaken. Both of us had distinctly heard a rustling sound coming from the back of the barrier which we had breached with the removal of one stone. "Maybe a bit of paper inside which moved with the change in the air," said Davidson, though I could catch the lack of conviction in his voice. He knew as well as I did that the rustle of a piece of paper could not have reached our ears through that one hole in the topmost course. Nor was that all. Still looking tensely at the opening we had made, we saw something curling out, something like a wisp of black smoke, which rose in the air and, strangely, seemed to stay there, gathering itself together into a rough shape. And with it there came a stench I can never describe. It was not of this earth of ours, and because of that, man has never invented the words to define it. To say it was foul, like the stench of a vast mass of corruption, would still be an understatement. On the instant, both of us bent down for the fallen stone. Both of us had the one thought, and the one thought only. That opening must be blocked up again. Immediately, quickly, at once. Somewhat to our surprise, the stone went in easily, and we packed it as tightly as we could. It looked very much as it had looked before. "Never again," said Davidson, wiping his brow. "Henceforth I shall keep to the motto, 'Let sleeping dogs lie.'" "And so shall I," came my immediate response. "More than that, though I'd hate to be called a coward, I've a feeling I'd be glad to be back in the car." "So you feel that way too?" he answered, looking me straight in the face. "I don't know what it is. I've been here often enough before, but now I want to be away and out of it. And what's more, out of it quickly." Without another word, he marched straight out of the ruins while I followed closely at his heels. Once I looked back. I could no longer see that strange shape of black smoke. It had gone. We were perhaps halfway back to the car, with Davidson striding ahead, when, behind me, I heard the steady pitter-pattering of a dog, following us. Barbara Napier's dog. Losing all control of myself, I ran for the car, calling out to Davidson as I passed him on the path. Reaching the car, I pulled open the driver's door and tumbled in, shutting the door with a bang. Only then did I begin to recover. Feeling safe again, and perhaps because of that, feeling also somewhat ashamed, I looked back to the path. Davidson was still plodding steadily on. Hadn't he heard the dog pattering behind us? Had I simply imagined it all? Nerves and nothing more? Or was it merely an ordinary dog that had run up for a moment towards us and that had turned off on its own intents and purposes? "Running that last bit for exercise?" asked Davidson as he opened the door beside me, but I noticed, quickly shutting it behind him. "I don't blame you. I felt like running myself. But I was damned if I would. And don't ask me why I felt like running. I don't know." "You didn't hear anything then?" I queried slowly. "No," he replied, "only the beating of my heart. I heard that well enough. But again, don't ask me why. All I can tell you is that I didn't like the atmosphere down there one little bit." "Let sleeping dogs lie, did I say? Somehow I have a feeling I wish we had." "We'll go," I said tersely, starting the car. I did not tell him of the pattering that had put me to shameful flight. We removed that stone a week ago, and today, by post, I received from Davidson a copy of the East Lothian and Berkshire Advertiser in which he had marked 2 passages. I can now recite them by heart. Local news, Wolf's Crag. Yesterday 2 visitors to Wolf's Crag were savagely attacked by a large black dog which appeared to have assumed the duty of guarding the entrance to the ruins. Fortunately, both of them had walking sticks, and they were able to some extent to protect themselves. As it was, however, one of them had to be treated by a doctor for a severe bite on the shoulder, and both of them are suffering from shock. See editorial comment, page 3. Editorial. Wolf's Crag. Under our local news, we print an account of an attack by a large black dog on 2 visitors at the ruined castle of Wolf's Crag. Our readers may be interested to know that according to local legend, Wolf's Crag was at one time long defended by another black dog, which was the terror of the countryside, and which was reputed to have been given by a witch to Logelin of Restalrig, then the holder of the castle. Fortunately, we live in the 20th century and have no longer to contend with witches and their spells. We understand that the Ministry of Works and the SSPCA have been informed of this attack, and it should not be long before the dog now at the ruins is either trapped or killed. In this second paragraph, the words, "another black dog," were heavily underlined, and following the final sentence were the words, in Davidson's handwriting, "I hope to God he is right." The end.